Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today we're going to do our podcast visually today because this requires a little bit of a modeling exercise that we'll get into towards the end or the middle of the talk. Okay? So the talk today is entitled The Non-dualists, Why They Are Wrong. Already I lost most of my Muslim audience who are unfortunately not very aware of what's going on in the world. And this is one of the subtexts that the Muslims have to wake up, and the Sufis, most of the Sufis, and become aware of what's going on in the modern world. There are a lot of implications for this, but this is going to be the subject of a whole other talk. Suffice it to say that the Muslims have to go beyond these multi-faith mediums and actually begin to understand what's going on in the real world and in many of the other spiritual disciplines and practices. And the current tendance or trend is non-duality. They have a huge seminar every year in California. Beware of anything that comes from California. Sorry, Hamza Yusuf. But that whenever I hear something coming from California, I get a little edgy, but, there are good things coming from there as well. So, the non-dualists. Okay, the other point I want to make before we start today, besides that the Muslims have to wake up and smell the coffee, as they say, is that how to use these tapes. A lot of people, I got a comment from someone, please don't take any offense, but that was a good listen. That's not enough, especially for anyone who hopes to be a student of mine. It's not enough just to listen and make this another form of entertainment. If you want to get maximum value out of it, you have to start looking into some of the subjects and researching them on your own. You'll hear a lot of names today, and each of these names is what Sheikh Nazim would have called an ocean. You can learn incredible amounts of stuff from each of these people. Let's remember that as Muslims and as Sufis, we've been practicing dhikr for about 1,500 years, I would say, approximately, from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The Buddhists have been working on this for 2,500 years, and the Hindus and the Vedantists probably more like 5,000 years. So we have something important to learn from these people in terms of their methodology of dhikr, what they call meditation. And this is what I'm hoping to contribute. So people who know some of the things I've written about know that I'm interested in the topic of comparative religion. I've written a number of articles about Buddhism, about Christianity, about shamanism. Most recently, I've been working on a book which includes a new chapter on Buddhism and a new chapter on shamanism. So this is a subject that I've been very interested in, but I've never really explored the subject of non-duality. As I said, this has become a big current. If you go through the history of spiritual movements in the United States in the 20th century, you see that it began with probably we could trace the beginning approximately to Alan Watts and Zen Buddhism, and then from Zen Buddhism we got into Bhakti Yoga under the auspices of Ram Dass and his guru Neem Karoli Baba, and then Hatha Yoga from the Shivananda movement. Mindfulness became really big, Vipassana, mindfulness, with the people coming back from Thailand and Burma. But recently, the tendance, the real trend these days is these non-dualists, sometimes also called Advaita Vedantists. Now, this is actually a very old tradition, but has more or less, thousands of years old, but has more or less been renewed, starting probably with the most prominent figure, Ramana Maharshi. Was probably the beginning that this movement took hold. This is one of his books, You can probably order it somewhere, if not at Amazon, at least at A-Books or Bookfinder or somewhere else. Well worth reading. Talks with Ramana Maharshi. So Ramana Maharshi is one of the big names in this movement, followed up by Papaji, who was one of his students, who started off being a spiritual seeker in the Krishna worship tradition and eventually came to see Ramana Maharshi. And at his meeting with Ramana Maharshi, he said the following, and I think we should pay attention as Sufis to this because it's very close to our own tradition. So this is what Ramana Maharshi said to Papaji when he eventually arrived at the ashram at Aranchala in the southern India. I cannot show you God or enable you to see God because God is not an object. Okay, we might not totally agree with that, but what he's referring to, in Sufi terminology, if you get to fana, then God is no longer an object because he becomes the subject. So God is not an object that can be seen, God is the subject. Okay, that's the highest state. I would disagree with this statement. God is also an object to be seen. If you want proof of that, read some of my material or anyone else's on the NDE, near-death experiences. People do see God, but we can't see him here in this lower world. He is the seer, God. Don't concern yourself with objects that can be seen. Find out who the seer is. Okay. This is the basis, actually, of the total non-duality movement, is instead of meditating on something other than us as object, to turn our perception, turn our attention backwards to the self, to the I am, as Nisargadatta calls it. Turn our attention back instead of forward. Now, those who are familiar with the mindfulness practices will realize that mindfulness is all about being mindful of objects. So you're mindful of your thoughts, and you're mindful of your physical sensations, and you're mindful of your breath. Okay? But the Advaita Vedantists, the non-dualists, go one step further and say, now become aware of awareness. Become aware of who is being, or what is being mindful, not what it is mindful of. In French, become aware of le référent au lieu de le référé. Go back to the subject. Okay, and this is the basis, if you want to understand the spiritual basis of the entire non-duality movement, that's it. Turn your attention backwards to the self, the small self, and then from the small self, you can make your way back to the absolute self. Richard Rose calls this the anterior umpire will lead you to the absolute umpire. Okay, those who've had some spiritual experience know what I'm talking about. Those who haven't, well, hopefully will help you on your way to get there. Now, another reference here for those who are interested is Rick Archer and the Bat Gap series. Bat Gap stands for Buddhist at the Gas Pump. Rick Archer is a former practitioner, or maybe even a current one, of transcendental meditation. He does some very nice interviews of many spiritual people, and he's had a special attention and affection, I would say, for non-dualists. Okay, some of the non-dualists that we run into in the modern days are people like, probably the most famous now is Eckhart Tolle. Krishnamurti may well have been seen as a non-dualist. Rupert Spira, who I personally do not very much appreciate, is kind of smug. His teacher, Francis Lucille, and more recently, in the name of scandals of spiritual teachers, Muji, who claims to have been a disciple of Papaji. Okay, these are all people involved with the movement. Two that I have enjoyed the most watching and listening to are Fred Davis and more recently even Richard Rose, who I really enjoy his writings. He's a West Virginian farmer type, and he talks, straight, and you can learn a lot from him in terms of his spiritual practice. Okay, so this is a very brief resume of the Advaita Vedanta or non-dualist movement. I encourage anyone who's seriously interested in spirituality to look them up, see what you could make of their practices. Personally, I am working myself on some of their practices, especially the turning the attention back to the attender, if you want, becoming aware of awareness, becoming aware of the witness rather than what is witnessed. It's actually a very powerful thing, frustrating at times, but illuminating at other times. And we will come back to it in developing our own Sufi spiritual practice and trying to integrate that into our form of dhikr. This will be explained at another point in time. But the real point of today, just so you don't get lost in the Advaita Vedanta movement or the non-dualist movement, the real point of today is focused on this model that actually seems very simple, but is actually very deep and comprehensive. And I think if we properly understand this model, the complete spiritual model, we will be able to put the Advaita Vedantists in perspective, especially in an Islamic Sufi perspective, which is what we're interested in, how to integrate their teachings into our format. So we see in this model, it's very simple, basically three sides to the triangle. Okay, let's start with the most simple, which is the humanistic side. Humanism is perhaps the biggest movement in our society. If you watch the American electoral campaign, you'll see that most of them are appealing to various aspects of the humanistic movement. Not all the humanists are atheists, but a lot of the humanists are, and some of them are agnostic, but they have a lot of clout in our modern society. Human rights, civil rights, all sexual orientation rights, all of these come from humanism. My own experience with humanism was very brief. I went to a meeting of the Montreal Humanistic Society in which the speaker was Henry Morgenthaler, famous for abortion rights. The vibe was it was in a beautiful house in Westmount. The vibe was so terrible that I left halfway through the meeting, and for me that was the end. That's my own spiritual approach when something just feels bad and negative, and I left it immediately. It doesn't mean there aren't some good things in humanism. Okay, so that's the B to C axis. That's the B to C line of the triangle. It's all around us. It's the most credible form of ideology. It's connected with liberalism and democracy and feminism and so many other things, all based on the reality of the human being, which we all have to experience. But there are other realities that people have felt the need to explore, and one of them is what the non-dualists do, I must say, remarkably well. Because I think of all the approaches, they may have the most clear-cut, efficient approach, even well beyond the Buddhists, of arriving at what people call enlightenment. In other words, how can you get from this relative being, whoever you are, Joel Ibrahim in my case, Hadi, Manira, how can you get from this relative being to the absolute being in a way that the two unite, fuse. So in Sufism we call this fana. The small ego, B, dissolves in the large, Allah has nafs, in the large ego, but let's call it being, because ego is a loaded term, in the absolute being, and then there's only the presence of absolute being, and that is an ecstatic, awesome, life-transforming experience. Sometimes it can happen briefly. If you look at the case of Eckhart Tolle, it took him about 2 years on a park bench to recover from it. It can be extremely powerful. There are probably people who actually die in that experience, and other people who just have flashes of it, and other people who work towards it their entire life and only get part of the way. Okay? So that is the process of enlightenment. That is this line. This is what the Buddhists are working at by sitting for hours and hours and hours and hours. We could also call it, in Buddhist language, you could also call it Nibbana. The Zen people call it Satori. There are many, the Hindus tend to call it Samadhi. There are many names for this axis. But if, as in the case of the non-dualists, we put all our accent here, we're losing important parts of the picture. Maybe even the most important part of the picture. Now, Islam, which is the religion that I'm practicing and the people who are studying with me, is largely focused. There are quotations and citations in both the Quran and the Hadith about this other dimension, but most of it is centered on this dualistic reality. I, the small self, Allah, the absolute self, and the relationship between the two. Now, in this dimension, we need the non-duality. It's important. It's not an illusion. And we need to practice our religion. Ibadah is the Arabic word for worship. To practice our religion, to get close to Allah, to gain the pleasure of Allah. There's this arrow which I didn't put a name on, but the experience in the other direction, still dualistic, is Allah has great mercy and compassion for His creation. So Allah is the creator, which the Dalai Lama and a lot of the Buddhists want to deny as a reality. We feel it's very important. Allah is the creator and we are the creation, and Allah has great love for the creation. I was a hidden treasure longing to be known, and so I created creation and I was known. Is a hadith Qudsi that some of the scholars say is not very authentic, but the truth of it is authentic. Okay, so this is Allah relative to His creation, and us relative to Allah. We owe Him our worship, we owe Him our obedience, we owe Him our submission, we owe Him our deepest respect, and ultimately awe. Fear and awe. Fear has a very bad reputation, but carried in this cosmic sense becomes awe, and that is the correct relationship, the highest relationship, if you want, to the absolute being, incarnated by our Prophet ﷺ. Now, if I fear for these people, honestly. The non-dualists are unconcerned about this dimension. They only want to pay attention to this one, and what is going to happen to them, and some of the Buddhists also, what is going to happen to them on the other side, reincarnation or not. They are accountable for their actions. The Quran makes us very aware that we're accountable. There are benefits to good behavior and consequences and punishment and reckoning for bad behavior. Ramana Maharshi actually hints at this in one thing I read a while ago, where he says, it doesn't matter actually whether you're enlightened or not. It's a good trip. It's a beautiful experience. It doesn't matter because this reality is there anyway, whether you know it or not. Whatever you do, nothing changes in the absolute being. What changes in the relative being, and I don't know about the people who are watching, but for myself, I'm very concerned, and we should be, about what happens on the other side. And what happens on the other side is going to be determined by this axis, not by this one. Because our relative being will not disappear. It may disappear temporarily, but it will always come back. One of the great Sufis, Junaid al-Baghdadi, was stop.